What is going on? There we go. All right. Okay, guys. So last class we talked about Worf's linguistic relativity, the idea that um, the idea that language influences how we think, or actually, it's called linguistic influence now. It used to be called relativity. Language influences how we think, and then we started talking about theories of intelligence. Charles Spearman's G factor or general intelligence, the idea that kind of like smart is smart, looking at specific intelligences and then seeing how different clusters of questions correlated with each other using what's called factor analysis, which is what they still use on intelligence tests. And then we talked about Gardner's multiple intelligences, which basically said, well, there's not one single intelligence. Intelligence is a spectrum of different abilities. And that is probably a better way of describing Gardner's. Is it about like things, different abilities that people excel at versus maybe they're not quite as good at? I think it's better to call them competencies than abilities. And it's, some of them are genetic and then some of it is environmental. And that's kind of what they have found with intelligence in general, that the genetic component of intelligence is around 50% or so. So today we are going to talk about the two other theories of intelligence. And then we're going to talk about how we design a test. And then we will talk about stereotype threat to finish up. Okay. So, but to start off, I want to do a little just thought experiment. And I want you to put your answers in the chat. I want you to think about it for a second and then put whatever you, this is an open-ended question. Okay. I want you to write down as many uses as you can think of for the following objects. For a brick for a blanket. Not together. You don't have to combine them. These are two separate questions. Okay? And I'll give you a sec to think about it. Whatever you come up with, just put it in the chat as a private message. And then we'll talk about it. Okay. Let's see. All right. Give everybody a sec to come up with some more. All right. Anybody else got anything? Okay. I'm getting a lot for a brick, but not many for a blanket. Any possible uses that you can think of? I would say not the most creative class I've ever seen, but all right. So let's see. All right. The brick, a house, a wall, a well, a mailbox, a weapon, to make a house, to break something, to throw at something, build a house, build a bridge, put yourself in bed, wrap yourself when you're cold. fold, make a wall, Legos, get someone to start a house, to crack things open, house, warmth, ghost costume to dry off, building a building, using a hat, breaking windows, drawing boundaries, making a foundation for a building, a lot of buildings. Okay. A weight for lifting weights, sleep with it, make a tent, make a whip for the tent for the blanket. Okay. Construction, all right, stay warm. Okay. All right. As a hiding spot, could use instead of a tarp for shelter. Use a step stool, dry off, superhero cape. Okay, put a dog on. Um, okay, all right, to hide, to, okay. All right, so the reason I asked that is because this is a real test. All right, this is what is called a divergent thinking test. And, we talk about divergent thinking, and when you start with one idea and then you expand out from that, with as many possible options as you can think of. And this is a real test that has been given at places like Google to assess levels of creativity. Okay, because so the most respected theory now on intelligence is what is called triarchic theory of intelligence. Now, Robert Sternberg and triarchic theory. Now, triarchic theory agrees with the general principle of Gardner's multiple intelligences, but not how specific it is. All right. Sternberg takes it from 8 and makes it into 3 different types of intelligence, of measurable intelligence. Analytical intelligence is one of them. Okay. What we would call book smarts. Okay. So this is the type of intelligence that's measured on like intelligence tests or in school. For Gardner, this would be like logical or linguistic, things like that. Okay. Analytical intelligence is just book smarts. Creative intelligence, the ability to come up with innovative and novel ideas. That is what that divergent thinking test is measuring. All right, saying to build a house with a brick is not all that creative. Saying that you can tie them to your feet and use them as shoes is more creative. Okay. Um, coming up, novel ideas, novel solutions. All right. Everybody, and all of us have differing levels of this. Everybody knows somebody that is maybe not the greatest student in the world, but they are really good at like coming up with ideas for things. They're like the idea guy. They're always coming up with different like ideas for companies or whatnot. But they might be a mediocre student, but they're really good with that sort of stuff. Things like musical intelligence would be in this. Spatial intelligence could be in it. Body kinesthetic. And then finally, practical intelligence. Street smarts is what we could call it. Okay. Being able to solve everyday tasks, being what we would call savvy. Essentially, what Sternberg actually described it as was having the ability to get what you want from the world. Okay. And, and a lot of people are very practically intelligent, but not very good in school. Okay. Somebody who is like is a really good ability to like make money. Like somebody who's like a really good drug dealer. Okay. That's high practical intelligence. Okay, street smarts. But and everybody knows somebody who is like gets hundreds on every single test, but then if like you spin them around 3 times in their house, they're going to get lost. Okay, right? Those people, some people have very high analytical intelligence, but low practical intelligence, meaning they're like clueless, right? And then some people have, high practical intelligence, but they're not like particularly good at school. There's a story about Robert Oppenheimer. Everybody know who Robert Oppenheimer was? Yeah, he was the head of Manhattan Project, which designed the atomic bomb. And Oppenheimer had very, very good analytical intelligence. He was obviously very smart. But there was, when he was in school at Cambridge, he had a math tutor, and he didn't like the way that the math tutor was teaching him something. So instead of saying, like, hey, I don't like the way that you're teaching me this, he tried to murder him. He tried to poison his math tutor because he didn't like the way that he was teaching something. And they brought Oppenheimer up into a board of all these people at the school to decide what they were going to do with him. And Oppenheimer was able to talk his way out of it and stay in school with literally no punishment at all for trying to murder a professor. That is practical intelligence. Okay. That is the ability to do an everyday task. I can't remember what he said. I read about Malcolm Gladwell tells the story in one of his books, either Outliers or Blink. I can't remember which one. Okay, but that is what practical intelligence is. Right? Being able to talk yourself out of a murder rap. All right. The way we can, and if you think about it as a triangle, and then we have the 3 different types. We got creative, analytical, and practical. Okay, and all of us are going to have different amounts of it. But you could think of this as a mnemonic that I saw on the AP Psych Facebook page is like the thinking cap. Okay, if you're trying to remember what the 3 different parts of triarchic theory are. All right, are there any questions there about triarchic theory? And then finally, one that is like kind of hotly debated on like is this an intelligence or whatnot is what's called emotional intelligence. Um, this is similar to this would fall into like Gardner's intra and interpersonal intelligences. People who have high emotional intelligence are people that are very like understanding. They understand how to use emotions sometimes to manipulate people. Um, but it's also could be somebody who is sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Like everybody has a friend, or maybe you're this person in your friend group that like all of your friends that like everybody goes to for advice or that everybody goes to just talk about their problems because this one friend recognizes that sometimes you just need to vent and they'll just sit there and listen to you and say I understand because nothing's more annoying when you're pissed off than somebody who's like trying to give you advice on how to fix it, right? Like that's like sometimes you just got to get shit out. All right, but that would be high emotional intelligence, people who are socially aware but then also self-aware. You can read others' emotions, but I stink at being comforting. I'm kind of that same way. I'm like, you they're there, like just like pat on the back and okay. All right, so there we are. Those are the 4 theories of intelligence that you need to know. So this was what I covered on the recorded lecture. So if you didn't watch that already, make sure you watch that. So now we got to talk about test construction. How do we construct a meaningful, whether it's an intelligence test or an EOC or an AP exam or any of those things? How do we construct a meaningful test? One that we can get good data out of. Let me get good water real quick. So there are a couple different components that we need to have a good test. And some of these you've probably heard of before, but you never really knew what it actually meant. So one of the main things when it comes to intelligence tests, EOCs, AP exams, meaning tests that are going to be given to a large group of people. One of the biggest things that we need to be able to do with tests like that is to be able to compare scores. And for you to understand when you take it, how does your score compare to other people? If you get a 28 on the ACT, all right, that's a good score. But if you don't know what the range is, then you have no way of knowing if it's a good score. Okay, so one of the main things that we need to do with intelligence tests and other tests like that is called standardization. Okay, now you all have all heard of standardized tests. You've all taken a lot of standardized tests. They love giving you standardized tests. Okay, but you probably never knew what that meant, that it was a standardized test. A standardized test is a test that has been standardized, meaning it is a test that has been given to a pre-tested representative sample, and that it is that they have based off of that they understand that that the information on it is information that is standard. So, and from that, they are able to get a range of scores, and you're able to see how does your score compare to other people's. Um, you know, you all have taken tests like EOCs, and sometimes when they're reading out instructions beforehand, the teacher will say like some questions may not be scored. Have you all heard that before? That's for standardization. That's for so that they can put those questions on there and to make sure that that is standard information that everybody, or at least the vast majority of people, are learning in a course. So one of the things is, are all the procedures the same? You all know with like EOCs and all that, all the crap you got to go through, all the instructions, blah blah blah. Has anybody ever been in a classroom where there was a test misadministration? Meaning like the teacher screwed up something, or somebody came in and like the teacher was on their phone, or like a phone went off during the test or anything. Okay, no. Well, that's taken away from standardization. A couple of years ago, we were pissed about this. There was at least one AP Psych test administrator in one of the classrooms that forgot to put up a clock, or they forgot to put the time on the board, like the start and the stop time. And so students didn't know when time was up until they got like the 5 minute warning. And a lot of them were like didn't even come close to finishing because they didn't know how much time they had. That gets in the way of standardization. All right. Are the questions from a standard banked for everyone? Even if they're not the same questions, are they all basically the same? And then is it scored in a consistent manner? That's why, like, whether it's multiple choice, whether it's short answer or whatnot, like for the AP Psych FRQs, in the past, not this year or last year, but in the past, all of the readers went down and did table reads for the first couple days before scoring the FRQs to come up with a rubric that everybody would use to make sure that it was standardized and that everybody knew how to score the FRQs. For standardized tests, hypothetically, when a test is standardized, scores should fall on a normal curve as well, meaning the range of scores should be predictable. Now, tell me beforehand, how many of you all have learned about the normal curve before and like how to read it? I think a lot more of you have than you think. All right, so this right here is what's called a normal curve or a bell curve or a standard curve, whatever you want to call it. Does anybody know what does this show us? If it is a standardized test and it falls and score, and what does this show us? All right, it shows us what the average of the test is. Okay, what is this right here? What is this bell-shaped thing? Come on, somebody knows this. You've got to, somebody has to know this. All right, the grades. All right, this bell-shaped thing, underneath all of this bell-shaped thing, is where all of the scores for an intelligence test or whatever it is should fall if the test is standardized. And the scores should fall like this, with the majority of scores falling in the middle, falling close to the mean. Now, before we go to the next slide, does anybody know what the term is, how we measure the average in which scores differ from the mean? Anybody know what that is? Standard deviation. Yep. Standard deviation tells us the average in which scores differ from the mean. And then that in turn will tell us what percentage of scores are going to fall within a certain range. The bell curve is essentially an algorithm. Okay. And these scores just get plugged in there and they hypothetically should tell you they should fall like this. So right here is a standard distribution. This thing is so annoying. There we go. It's a standard distribution for IQ scores. The average IQ is 100. Okay, make sure you know that. That's the symbol for average. It's like a cursive M, and then the average is 100. The standard deviation for IQ is 15. What that means is on average, scores differ 15 points from 100. Now, the reason that we know that we need to know this is because on a normal curve, okay, a normal curve is going to measure scores going 3 standard deviations above and below the mean. And within 3 standard deviations, 99.7% of scores are going to fall. Now you might be saying, what the hell are you talking about? But this is actually, this is actually not that difficult. What we do with standard deviation, so right here, this is 1 standard deviation below the mean, and this is 1 standard deviation above the mean. What this tells us here is that 34% of scores are going to fall between 85 and 100, and then 34% of scores are going to fall between 100 and 115. And 68% of scores are going to fall between 85 and 115, which is within 1 standard deviation of the mean, 1 standard deviation above or below. Is everybody following this? Yeah. Okay. 2 standard deviations below the mean, right, is 70, because you just subtract 15. Here's 1 standard deviation, here's 2, you just subtract 15 to get it. 2 standard deviations above the mean, the IQ is 130. 14% of scores are going to fall between 70 and 85, and between 115 and 130. And 95% of scores are going to fall between 70 and 130. 95% of IQs are going to fall between intellectual disability and getting up there towards genius. All right. And then finally, 3 standard deviations from the mean. 55. 55 is 3 standard deviations below, and then an IQ of 145 is 3 standard deviations above. Does anybody know, or anybody, what percentage of scores are going to fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean? Anybody have a guess, or see if you can figure it out? Yeah, Rohan, you're very close. These are all kind of rounded up. And so it's actually within 3 standard deviations of the mean, the official number is 99.7%, because all of these have been rounded. Like this one is actually supposed to be like 13.8 or something like that. But 99.7% of IQ scores are going to fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean. Now, what about these right here? What about the 0.1% on each side? Anybody know what those are called? What that's called? Outliers. Yep. And outliers only make up 0.2% of scores, but they can be as far, with IQ, it could be an IQ of 0 or an IQ of, I'm trying to think what the highest IQ that's ever been measured is, like 200. I don't think they can measure beyond that. So if I were to ask you, just let's see, and answer this in the chat as a private message. If I were to ask you, what percentage of scores, if your IQ is 115, what percentage of scores fall above your IQ? What percentage would it be? Yep, Rohan, yep. No, Sylvia, I think you looked at it wrong. What percentage of scores fall above 115? All right. The correct answer is 16.1. Okay, the way you do that is, all right, 14% of scores are going to be 2 standard deviations above. So 14% are between 115 and 130. 2% are above 130 and 145. And then 0.1% are above 145. Okay, you just add those up to find this. Okay, now just so we know, all you need to know for right now is IQ. But just so we know, these numbers always stay the same on a normal curve. These numbers down here could change with anything. If the average is a 72 and the standard deviation for something is 3, then you would go like 72, 69, 66, so on and so forth. But we're gonna do another lesson on this before the AP exam, because these come up a lot on the AP exam. This is also what it's based on. Like, if you all ever heard that you scored in the 92nd percentile, or your child's in the 95th percentile in height at this age. That's what this is based on. Okay, that means that you scored better than 92% of people, or whatever. All right, any questions on that? So, because of this, because these scores fall on the normal curve, all right, and because they're standardized, what they have found is that IQ tests need to be re-standardized every few years. Like, they go back and they re-standardize them every few years to make sure that average IQ stays a 100 because of what is called the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect is this statistical anomaly that shows that IQ is slowly rising around the world. And actually, in the United States, it's gone down slightly. But in a lot up until the past couple years, it had been going up in the U.S. and then it started dropping. But in most modernized Western countries, they have found that IQ is slowly rising. Okay, anybody know why might this be? What could a possible explanation of this be? We can't evolve that fast. So, all right, technological innovations, maybe anything else? All right, yeah. The general consensus, although they don't really know, but the general consensus is more education. That around the world, people have access to more education. They also have found that diet has played a role in it. Childhood brain development has come earlier on because of healthier diets and whatnot. All right. So, are there any questions about standardization? The next thing we have to make sure that we have in a test is what is called reliability. Reliability is, if I give you the same test multiple times, do you score relatively similar on it each time? Especially if it is an aptitude test, meaning measuring potential. So, are the results consistent and stable? Um, who in here has taken the ACT or the SAT multiple times? Anyone? I forget this is a really young class. Okay. Well, those of you that, a lot of y'all probably haven't even taken it yet, but those of you whose plan is to just take it until your little heart's content, you're just going to take it every month for a year. Don't do that. Okay. It's dumb and it's a waste of money, because those tests they're not measuring your knowledge per se. They're measuring your potential ability. And so you can prepare for them all you want, but there's only a certain level of preparedness you can reach with those tests. What they have found is that what you should do is go in to take it once cold with no preparation. That way you can kind of get a sense of the test and then prepare, like get one of those SAT or ACC preparation books, prepare for a couple of months, and then take it again. What you'll generally see is a big jump between the first time and the second time because you practice. It's called the practice effect. But after the second time, you're probably not going to go up by much because those tests are very reliable. Okay, they yield consistent results. What is called test retest reliability. Has anybody in here ever anybody, those of you who've taken like a personality test before, like 16 personalities, which is the free version of the Myers-Briggs, have you gotten multiple personality types before, like depending on different times that you've taken it? They were similar, but not exactly. Yeah. Those tests, the Myers-Briggs has a 50% test retest reliability, meaning there's a 50% chance that if you take it take it once and then take it again 3 weeks later, you'll get a different personality type. I go back and forth between INTP and ENTP, just kind of depending on like my mood. Are there multiple forms of the test? If so, do they yield consistent? Are the results for the question similar? With IQ tests, they have about a 90% test retest reliability. Meaning, if you take an IQ test and you're like, "Oh, I don't like the result of that. I'll just take it again," you're going to get the same thing. You're maybe just not as smart as you think you are. I did this a couple years ago. I went through and I chose students and to look at the test grades in class. Now, this is not from this year, but if you look at these, even from test to test in a class, like our tests, at least the ones that we've given in the past, have been relatively reliable and they yield consistent results each time. Like people rarely differ from what they normally get unless there's just a massive amount of cheating going on. And so, all right, any questions on reliability? All right, last thing with this, validity. Validity is how well does a test actually measure what it is supposed to be measuring, the criteria of it. And there are a couple different types of validity. Content validity is basically like, is the content of the test, it's also called criterion validity, is the content of the test what it's supposed to be testing on? If I put questions about the Battle of Gettysburg on a psych test, that would have low content validity because it's not actually asking about what the test should be asking about. This is mostly it's more common with achievement tests, but it can be with both. But like, if for a driving test, if they had you drive a boat instead of a car, right, the content validity of that would be low because it's not actually testing what they're supposed to be testing you on. So there's content validity. Is the content what it's supposed to be? And then there's what's called predictive validity, which is if it is predicting something, if it is an aptitude test, is it accurately predicting future behavior? The NFL Combine is supposed to predict how well somebody will do in the NFL. It doesn't really have a high rate of validity. What about, the two biggest tests for predictive validity are the ACT and the SAT. What do those two tests? What are they trying to? What are they supposed to be able to predict? Anybody know? You just take them. He was like, I just got to take the. I don't know what this is for, but I just know that everybody does it, so I have to go do it. Yeah, predicts. They're supposed to predict how well you'll do in college. Now, do they? Do they have high predictive validity? What do you think? Just take a guess. Anyone? Bueller? Okay, yes. Yeah, they actually do. They do relatively well, or especially the SAT is really good at predicting freshman year of college GPA. What your GPA will be as a freshman. Now, it's not necessarily good at predicting later on. Anybody know what the most predictive thing is of how well you'll do in college? Yeah. High school GPA is more predictive than aptitude tests, but the two of them combined are the most predictive overall. But GPA is actually better at predicting than SAT, ACT. All right. Anybody got any questions about any of that stuff? I know that validity and all that is not it's not super exciting or anything like that. Okay, we are going to do one more thing. So there is another PowerPoint, and I'm just going over this right now because it's quick, but it's the one for today. Go ahead and pull that up real quick, and we're going to go over this stereotype threat, and I got a quick video for you to watch. Okay, so this right here, guys, intellectual disability, Down syndrome, PKU, it can be genetic, but intellectual disability is when IQ falls more than two or more standard deviations below the mean on an IQ test. So 70 is considered to be intellectually disabled. Okay, so you can see here there are different severities of it. You don't need to know these. Like just know that 70 or below is considered intellectually disabled. All right, we're going to talk about that next class. All right, last thing, stereotype threat. This goes more along with testing, but I just kind of have it at the end right here. Stereotype threat and IQ scores are really just testing in general. Stereotype threat is a very interesting phenomenon that they've observed with different groups. Could be racial groups, could be sex. Okay, that if a group of people or if a person is told before taking a test, whether it's an IQ test or a regular test or whatnot, if they are told beforehand that any group that they are a part of generally scores poorly on that test, they will tend to score significantly worse than if they had not known that information. Basically, the stereotype becomes a threat to them. So they found that African Americans, if told that they generally have lower IQs on an IQ test, will score lower than they should. Okay, that women being told that they have generally don't score as well in high level mathematics, tend to score lower than they would expect. Does anybody know what this is called other than stereotype threat? The idea that you believe something is going to happen, so through your own actions, it ends up happening. A placebo effect is an example of this thing. Harry Potter is actually one of these too. Yes, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's also something, I don't have it on here, called stereotype lift. That like stereotype lift is if you're told beforehand, like, oh, it's a math test. Oh, and you're Asian. Asians usually do really well on math tests. They actually tend to. That's positive stereotypes can lift you up and make you perform better than you normally. All right, so we're gonna watch a quick video on this. Okay, and it talks about a very famous study that was done that a lot of y'all probably know about. And then I will let you all go.